welcome to the stage Roland Atoui, Managing Director at Red Alert Labs.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak in English. I hope that's okay for everyone. It's hard to me actually to address this topic in Arabic. I'm really honored to be here. I want to thank you all for having me here. I want to thank the organizers for this really great venue. I present myself. I'm Roland Atoui. I'm coming to you actually straight from Paris, France. I'm Managing Director of Red Alert Labs, a security consulting and evaluation lab focused on IoT and on cybersecurity certification schemes. So I'm going to tell you probably a story. So 20 years ago, if I tell you that, using your phone, I can get access to your password, or steal your password to get access to your email account, or have a copy of your fingerprints, you would probably look at me and tell me, Roland, you watch too much James Bond. But today, thank you. All right. So today, if I tell you that using your toaster, I can actually get access to your Facebook account, you will probably panic and plug off this evil thing. So welcome to the new era of the Internet of Things, where here. Maybe this one? All right, perfect. Welcome to the new era of the Internet of Things, where more digitally connected devices are encroaching on every single aspect of our lives. From our homes, from our offices, you can see them actually in our cars, and even sometimes in our bodies. So are we heading actually to this new era of cybersecurity challenges? Are we able to trust those connected things? Finally, what actually security are we trusting? So how do we measure that trust? And why actually what we used to use to measure actually in IoT IT products before don't really hold for measuring IoT connected devices? So sorry for that. So before actually we answer those questions, I will probably actually try to, have the same understanding of what we are talking about. Okay, so what is IoT? Probably not everybody, have the same understanding of what is this. Why is talking about it today, and why it's so hard to secure? Okay, why are we actually having that issues? So, over the last decades, we have seen the transitions from PC connected devices to smartphones, right? So and recently, we started to see also more smart things to be surrounding us. So smart meters, smart cars, smart appliances, smart speakers. So this innovation actually was called at the beginning machine to machine, or M2M, and then actually more broadly called Internet of Things, where more connected devices can, using the network, can communicate with each others, but also with their environment, okay, with the nature and their infrastructure, and also they can, communicate with us humans. We see a lot of benefits in the industry using IoT. That's why actually we are seeing it popping up in different industries. So it's amazing actually how many industries are moving toward digitalizations and also incorporating IoT to increase the benefits. That usually starts actually economically to be, quantified. So if we go deep actually into what is really a IoT device, for example, many organizations actually started tried actually to put up a standard architecture of what is Internet of Things. But since actually we have a lot of use cases, there's no really standard one that we can reuse. But most commonly, actually, we can identify 5 domains in the Internet of Things ecosystems. That starts actually with an IoT device, so it's actually the hardware and the software that actually incorporates some sensors and actuators, and those typically collect some data, which is actually information that is collected from the environment, such as, I don't know, temperature, humidity, or geolocalizations. And so it sends this data through the network, wireless network, to sometimes to the gateway, where actually, if you have different connected devices, it collects that information and transfer it then to the wireless connectivity through the servers or the cloud, where we act upon this data, we analyze it, we process it, and we transfer it to what we call like business applications. So those business applications finally will enable, for example, to alert the users upon an activity, and also sometimes automatically to send back some information to the device and react to something. So why actually we're talking about this today, right? Maybe there will be like embedded systems so far, and we have some connectivity. So if we look back actually in 2004, 2006, we started seeing actually some really microcontrollers, microprocessors that had increased the capacity and the capabilities of processing while lowering the power consumption as much as possible and becoming very cheap. These things were coupled as well with also the Bluetooth low energy back in 2006, and so coupled together, we've seen them, fitting into different form factors, more than mobile devices. So that actually made it very simple to adopt and to develop, and that's why actually we see it in around 2010, that growth of connected devices, when we're expecting that in 2020 we'll be surrounded in the world by 50 billion connected devices. So some numbers actually are higher or lesser, but that's basically the idea if you want to understand. So it could be like every single person will be connected to 6 devices in average. So we're talking about those benefits, okay, from the Internet of Things, but that naturally, actually, with those benefits come a lot of cybersecurity challenges, right? So what is actually really scary somewhere is that the Internet of Things is not just about data. It does actually interact with this environment, meaning that impacts on the data may have other impacts finally on the surrounding, okay, what is it on the safety of people, on the environment, and that makes actually the let's say the harder to secure, and and have a little bit more ways to understand what is the risk if we actually don't really secure the Internet of Things in the world. So why is it so hard to really secure? So it is definitely, when you talk about 50 billion connected devices, you will directly understand that actually, attackers will find more ways, will find actually a lot of more ways and surface of attacks to address the Internet of Things, those devices. So it's uncontrollable in a way, and typically those attacks could happen as usual, whether on the the software or the server side, or on the network side, and some of them are more physically on the device itself. Another aspects actually of as well of making it actually more hard to secure is that those devices sometimes they will stay around 20 to 30 years in on the field. And that's typically in the infrastructure control systems, for example, critical systems, sorry, and such as smart meters. So it's not easy to, let's say, follow the threats landscape changes during the time, right? So we have to think about upgrading the security, following up with it, and that's not easy at all. There are devices as well that usually are unreachable, so they are like, I don't know, in some plants 20 kilometers away from your administration system. So it's not easy actually to control these physically, and also they are in nature, so meaning they have the attackers could have physical access to these. So how do we secure these actually as well against such type of physical attacks? There are also very major issues related to the constrained resources that those, more or less smart devices could have. So you understand directly that we cannot actually sometimes use the same security implementations on really small devices where cryptography would not really work, or the time to process crypto operations. So those things should be adapted to those typical devices, and that's not an easy way to do. Of course, standardization was very much unmature since back a few years, and you've seen actually this growth. So the industry were not waiting; they were implementing different protocols, different OSs, different applications and systems. So that's make it very hard to find one solution that fits all, right? So and finally since actually they are not waiting actually to security to adopt those things, so don't really spend time on developing security by design, and that's actually what makes it very hard as well to understand what's security about. So when you're talking about security, how have you asked yourself actually how do we measure security? Is it actually a simple ruler that actually we use to measure like every single units that we use to measure? So it's a bit the same, but it's a bit more complex. I mean, the same in the fact that humans, we actually created some metrics to be able to measure security. So some standard organizations, they created what we call certification schemes that will give you a sort of level of security, of robustness against type of attacks. And those in the IT world, they've been like several of them that could apply on different types of devices, from the embedded system to software, to a lot of things that we probably needed a lot of security. But those actually schemes, we cannot just compare them as being, a ruler. There are some specific criteria that we can give them and try to compare them if we want really to see which is better than the other. Some of them, for example, would be recognized in your country, okay, and not, for example, in France. Okay, so that's the recognition aspect of it. Some of them are more or less formal in defining the criteria of what actually we would like to evaluate, for example, to see how to measure. Others are specific to a scope, so they, for example, are specific to, smart cards, to authentication, but they are not, having all the means to evaluate a lot of other stuff and compare them. Some of them are more or less objective, okay, say meaning that they actually do provide some results, but actually, are we able to repeat them? Are we able, if we change the pen tester, for example, to get the same results? This is not really a simple aspect, actually, that is if you don't take care of it during those measurements. There is also different levels, so some of them are more or less flexible in giving you, basic security, basic risk evaluation, and to upper to the higher ones. And finally, of course, you can see there how much they cost. So it's an effort, work, time. So it costs more or less differently when you use one of these measures. So we talk about security. So finally, how do we trust in that security? Let's say it's not the trust that we're talking about, just actually the impression actually that the user finally will have in how much that product is secure, really. We're talking about a bit trust that is related, all the stakeholders in that measurement and certification schemes. So that trust relies on the technical aspect, of course, so how to verify and check actually the security, but it also relies on reputations, on transparency of those that are able to conduct those measurements, as well on definitely regulations and some commitments and contractions. So this is actually, if you try actually to put a ruler and say actually that we want to get how actually do we measure security, for instance. So the idea is actually we are able to give some level of trust in the countermeasure, and that actually those implemented in the products are sufficient and correct implemented to minimize the risk of having a successful threat, putting up a vulnerability on a certain product and then compromising in assets. And that as much as actually we go deeper into looking down, for example, into the design and the information of the product, as much as we get confidence in that security, right? As much as we look more broadly in the information, the scope actually of what we are studying, as much as we can give confidence. And that confidence is even increased when you involve a third party, for example, and when you involve simplification schemes, regulations, that will actually govern somehow the metrics or the criteria to be able to provide such a level of security. So what's the problem actually with those today? You've noticed probably, or you have probably some experience with it or not, but today actually if you want to apply things that we used in common criteria, for example, which is recognized in many countries today, they cost a lot, they need a lot of time, and we're talking about 4 months to 2 years sometimes to evaluate something, okay, and to give finally a stamp, which is not really, simple and very costly to reuse for IoT. So the real problem does not come really from just this. It does come from the fact that in the industry we don't really understand the value of security today. That's actually at least from some years ago, and so the vendors differentiate the product from their feature and the costs, and does not actually take into account the security, because the consumer himself would not actually use, see actually differences if you actually increase your password authentication or put your fingerprint. It for him is not really a differentiator as of today. And so when you say this, meaning that those manufacturers are not spending the time, the money to evaluate those during the design, and so to implement security by design. So, so if you actually you want to use these things to the IoT, to this 50 billions, you will simply you're not able actually to have enough resources and time to do it. Okay, that's just simple equation. And if you want to use something which is subjective, so what is actually finally the value of your measurements? What would be actually, how actually would you be able to compare those products? And finally, how actually the consumer of those connected devices will feel the value of cybersecurity, of those measurements. So IoT security, and that's the message that I wanted to pass from the beginning, is that it's not just technical issue, as we discussed at the beginning. It's also a commercial issue that actually should be taken into account. So the solution of that problem is not one size fits all. Okay, so we don't really want to have solution, but we have, let's say, more than 20 years of experience in the IT product certifications, and we need to understand that we have learned a lot of lessons. So reinventing the wheel is not an option. So we need to reuse many things, of course, but we have to define some goals, such as allow a rapid and agile product manufacturing lifecycle, reduce the evaluation cost and time, create incentives and awareness for the vendors, consider trainings, recognize self-assessments when it's possible, provide some simple metrics to the vendors and the evaluator, recognize existing evaluations, consider the full operational environment, allow the customer and the vendor to compare products objectively, and finally, able to use something that will be recognized. So won't you actually spend money each time to, access new markets, for instance. so if you take that solution, it would give you an idea of the maybe the criteria that we probably have to work on is definitely the costs and this formal aspect, which actually usually takes a lot of time when it's more formal, and we will be able, let's say, to drive a better solution for that thing. So the solution of such thing is to add what we call the assurance to your security lifecycle development. Okay, so that's basically you use probably to have a secure development life cycle, so you would take risk into account and then actually you build up some real measures in order to ensure that you implement some security from the beginning. But if you don't really verify such thing, okay, you're not able actually to provide any specific trust in what you have been implemented. So a scheme that could allow such things for the Internet of Things will help a lot, and that is actually driven today by many initiatives in Europe, is to simplify the certification schemes or standards that we used to allow the quick and fast evaluations, to allow security by design and assurance to be integrated from the beginning, and not just actually to act before the launch of the product to just evaluate the product. And that's basically should lead to a solution per market in IoT, okay? Because sensitive data has different means when you go to the industrial ecosystem or to the consumer ecosystem or the critical systems. So those solutions must be adapted for each sector, and requirements should be driven in an automatic way, take into account some specific methodologies. So I will finalize by saying that trusted security is a need to have, not a nice to have. So that's something probably you already know. But think about adding trust or assurance factor to your secure development lifecycle. And because security actually is never 100%. You have to understand that the risk will exist always. You have to accept them. You have to realize that actually how much actually those risks exists. And if you want to trust this, you have to verify. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention. And so if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer, or otherwise I'll be available outside. Okay. Anyway, feel free to reach me anytime, actually, during the conference. Thank you very much.
There's a question there. Excuse me?
There's one question here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. If you want to do a vulnerability assessment for IoT and include that or penetration testing to ensure, of course, that vulnerabilities there is there a certain framework that you work with or what?
Yeah. Yes, there is. There are some solutions. There are unfortunately private for the moment. Because the standards are being developed. For example, we're working with ENISA, the European European Agency for Cybersecurity, on putting such frameworks into standardization and getting them recognized. So my recommendation today is that you can use the existing certification schemes to just integrate and prepare yourself to include that assessment by design as much as possible, as much as early possible, and then once actually those regulations are being put in place, you'll be able to map what you have done already and prove that your security does fit into such regulations. Yeah.
But is certification is it enough without testing, real testing for the security and the security issues? Is it enough, without the real testing and vulnerability testing of these devices? Is certification is only enough? Because mainly certification depends on
No.
like
So certifications attest that you have done testing, that the lab have done testing, from vulnerability scanning to penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, and that is part of the process of measurements, right? So it will tell you that you are secure against those types of attacks from hardware to software, and will give you that level of assurance. So of course, this actually stamp will give you assurance. Today you are secure. If you do not implement things that actually will allow you to update your security, that actually the certificate won't be able to follow up with that. Okay, so there are ways to as well have a valid certification and maintain the certificate during the whole life cycle process, even after when you launch actually your product. But definitely pen testing and I mean assessment is part of the certification. It's not a self declaration of what you are doing. Okay, you trust, you verify through testing.
And for testing, is there a certain frameworks for IoT specific,
so
especially for IT?
So frameworks, when you talk about frameworks, meaning tools or techniques, because frameworks there are some different standards. So you can use, for example, there is what we call the IoT Security Foundation framework. You have the GSMA IoT framework. You have the private framework like ours, Red Alert Labs framework. You have OWASP IoT, for example. If you want to drive the top 10, for example, vulnerabilities in IoT, you can use that framework, and many others in the US as well. Standardization is going to probably converge to hopefully one standard, but it won't be actually one size fits all. So it will be targeted per market in IoT. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have a question.
So in the last few years, many of the researchers have turned to try to research vulnerabilities in the IoT, because mainly they are not secured enough and easy to hack. But in many of these cases, the vendors doesn't fix the issue. So is there any approach of something that may, like a framework or something legal that can make the vendor have a patch lifecycle, like normal operating systems, like normal products?
The two presenters actually before me actually would have probably answered the question. It's regulations. So if you actually don't really add that regulation as being, you know, the one or the certification scheme that will enforce the vendor to think about security or to get them responsible for what they produce, they will never actually do it. Unless as well there is an incentive from the market that values the security, meaning the consumer is able to pay that $2 additional on that device because this is more secure. And so it's really that concept. Otherwise, there are also the the insurance companies. So they are also looking into putting some, you know, some or requesting from the vendors to prove their security, because finally they are the ones who are gonna pay if the cyber attack happens. So finally, each of those three solutions would help to enforce and to prevent the vendors doing bad things. And of course, toolings should be automated as much as possible to allow to, let's say, prevent the worst cases. Okay, I don't know, many of the attacks on IoT were like really very, you know, didn't require a lot of, you know, common sense, like default passwords and things like that. So they could be actually, you know, there are means actually to verify them in a really non-costly way, but then who will gonna enforce that, right? Regulations or others? Thank you very much. Okay.